So, hello everyone. I'm delighted to welcome Adam Alter here today. You will have received his book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough. I hope some of you have had a chance to dive into that already. But as part of the launch of 1,000 Breakthroughs, I'm going to interview him about the book, ask him some questions. So, first of all, what inspired you to write the book? Why Breakthroughs?
Well, first, I'll just say thanks very much for having me and for distributing the book. I really appreciate that so many of you are reading it, and I hope it ends up being useful for you. So I wrote the book. This is my third book now. All of the books I've written have been about issues that I have faced personally. So either they've been about research that I've spent decades on, or they've been about topics that really affected me. My previous book was about how people in general can't remove themselves from screens, that we're so glued to our screens. And then this most recent book about breakthroughs, it sort of dawned on me that humans take being stuck very personally. It feels like this sort of almost personal affront when you're stuck, and it feels very isolating. And I think that was especially true during the pandemic when we were so socially isolated anyway. And I wanted to try to see whether there might be in the literature and in some of my own work a sort of guide that you could give to people to move from being stuck to breakthroughs, and something more formulaic, like a kind of step by step, here are some things you should do. And it turns out that there is, and I think it's captured in the book. And so I wanted to share those ideas with people more broadly, and that's what the book is an attempt to do.
I love that. I think the idea of that sort of step-by-step guide to how you can deliver breakthroughs is the kind of thing that will be really helpful for all of us at EssenceMediacom. I love that it comes from personal experience as well. So it'd be great to hear from you an example of a time when you've been stuck and what your biggest breakthrough was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think often what happens when we get stuck is a good thing turns into something that's not so great. So for me, I was very lucky coming out of high school in Australia. I got a scholarship to do actuarial science, and it seemed like an incredible opportunity. I was part of the first cohort of students doing this particular scholarship, but it became very clear to me about 3 or 4 weeks in that that wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. And actuarial science is fantastic for a lot of people. It wasn't right for me, and I felt trapped and I felt stuck, and I wasn't sure what was the right career path for me. And so what I ended up doing was, sort of without realizing it, because it was 20 something years ago, I borrowed one of the ideas from the book, which was to say, I don't really know what the menu of options looks like. If I'm going to choose a career, I am not in a good position to do that as an 18-year-old who's just come out of high school. So the best thing I thought I could do was to explore the world as broadly as possible in that moment. And so the scholarship, I had another 6 months before which I had to leave the university or do something new. And so I spent that 6 month period almost every day going into the university. I was living at home, so I'd drive into the university and I'd look at this big board. There was actually a physical board that listed all the subjects, all the courses that were on that day. And I would just stumble into random lectures. And so I got a taster of 100 different degree programs, 100 different careers. I realized very quickly that there were things I definitely did not want to do. But I also got a taste for law and psychology, which ended up being the double degree that I did. And I would never have known that. I could never have possibly seen that as a breakthrough, as the path that I should be taking, without having sampled from the 100 or the 98 no's to find the 2 yeses. And so that was one example. I've been stuck, like I imagine so many people have many times, but that was the most sort of profound experience where I felt really trapped, but found a way through using one of the techniques I talk about in the book.
Yeah, and that's a really underappreciated technique that I think. I think people are afraid sometimes of getting it wrong, and actually, you take the learnings from making lots of mistakes to help you find the right path to go forward. So I
Yeah.
like that. So how can individuals and organizations learn from that and develop the ability to adapt to change more effectively? I mean, we don't always have time to attend 100 lectures to get the two right ones.
No, that's true. I mean, so broadly speaking, what I was doing in that case, and there are lots of other ideas in the book, but I think this is an especially powerful one. It's the distinction between an exploration mode and an exploitation mode. So I think when we feel pressured or when we feel like we're in a rush to do something, when there's a deadline, for example, we rush to exploit. Exploiting basically means becoming one track focused on a particular thing. So if I'm a company and I have 10 possible ideas, I very quickly realize I don't have enough time and I pick one, and that's all I'm going to focus on, all I'm going to think about. I put blinkers on, so that's all I'm channeling all my energy into. When you do that too quickly, you leave a lot of great ideas on the table. You're much less likely to have a breakthrough. That would have been like if I'd said, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to find the first thing that's sort of low level viable and then do that. Now, you're right. It takes some time to do what I did there, but you can explore very quickly. And so you can only be in one mode or the other. You can either be exploring, where you have a broad view, you try different things, you experiment, you hold, say, 3 or 4 or 5 or more ideas aloft at any moment in time, and then you pick one ultimately, and then you exploit that idea. When you're exploring, you can't exploit because you're looking broadly. And when you're exploiting and going deep and focusing on this one thing, you are not looking at other options. So I think it's very important to recognize that there's a ton of research that shows that when you explore, then exploit. If you look at careers, if you look at the golden periods in people's careers, they come following periods of exploration followed by exploitation. I'll just give you an example to illustrate that. The painter Jackson Pollock, the American painter, one of the most famous American contemporary painters or modern painters, he spent a period of about 8 or 9 years exploring all sorts of different styles. He tried to borrow from Cubism and Surrealism and Expressionism and Impressionism. He didn't know what his identity was going to be. And then one day, paint dripped off his paintbrush and landed on the canvas in a way that he'd never seen expressed before. And so he started throwing paint to the canvas. This is his drip technique that he became famous for. And he exploited that. And when he was asked later about that, for the next 5 years, every painting he did was of this kind of drip technique where he threw paint to the canvas, which made him the artist who's responsible for the most expensive work that's ever been sold at auction by an American. He basically said, I didn't know that was the right thing until I'd ruled out all these other ideas. There was something very powerful about going through that process of exploration. And there are lots of examples documented in the literature and in my book as well that I think suggest the importance of having the broad view, then the narrow view. And I think that often works extremely well for people in lots of different contexts.
I like that structure of explore and exploit. How do you think people what advice could you give people on how to get the balance right in that when they're planning their work?
Yeah, so there are 2 ways to know that it's time to switch from exploration to exploitation. One of them is just giving yourself a deadline. So let's say I have a client, I have a brief, I'm an agency, I'm trying to decide where to place an ad or what among 3 different approaches is going to work best. At some point, you're going to have to deliver one solution. No client wants you to explore and then deliver what you found during exploration. They need the fruits of your exploitation. So one thing to do is to say, we have 6 months. Our due date is in 6 months. Let's spend a month exploring. Or you could say, let's split the 6 months into 2 3-month long periods. There's going to be an initial period of exploration, then exploitation. So we'll explore for a month and then have 2 months of exploitation. Then we'll have another week of exploration just to see that we're on the right track. And then we'll go back to exploiting again. So you can turn it on and turn it off. That's using time as your guide. If you aren't as bound by time, you can also say, I know when I get to the point where I'm ready to exploit because I've found an idea that is not just viable, but that gets above the bar of whatever I think of as suitable. It's a good enough idea. And I'll know when I get there because you have enough people who are working on a project that they can figure it out, or you can figure it out from experience. So those are 2 ways to do that. And then when do you go from exploitation back to exploring again? Exploitation is great until it doesn't work anymore, until you hit a wall and you feel stuck. So that could be, I've been doing the same thing for 10 years, or I'm in the same role that I've been in for 10 years, or I've been doing this particular approach or using this approach for so long that it's starting to feel a bit stale. That's the moment when you switch back into exploration mode. So you've got to be a little bit sensitive to outside external cues that give you a subjective sense of when it's time to change. But you can also be guided by objective cues like the passage of time, a week, 2 weeks, a month. So deadlines are very helpful there, especially if you're managing a team. I think just relying on gut instinct probably isn't going to get the job done.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful advice. Now, what advice would you give to someone who feels that achieving breakthroughs is beyond them? Perhaps people who've got fewer years in the industry or perhaps in non-client facing roles.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are 2 basic theories of creativity and of coming up with breakthroughs. One of them is known as the insight theory or the insight lens. And through this lens, we think of some people as having this kind of, I don't know, celestial talent that just sort of comes down from above and lands on them. And some people have it and some people don't. And so there are people who are better at coming up with breakthroughs than others. And it is true, there is natural variance in that. Some people think more divergently. They are generally maybe a bit more creative than others. But the second lens is the production lens or the productivity lens. This is actually what carries the day much more. And the idea here is that you can manufacture breakthroughs and creative ideas with the right approaches. And why this is important is because we tend to think that most of the variance in good ideas comes from whether the right person is having them. Are you a particularly creative person? There's a lot of research that suggests that I, on my worst day, might be a 2 out of 10 on creativity, but on my best day, I'm an 8 or a 9. The variance within each person is dramatic. So often, if you're a little bit down on your creative ability, it might be a period where you've been closer to a 2 or a 3, or maybe you're a bit tired, or maybe you're just not functioning at your very best. But we all have the capacity under the right circumstances to be a 7, 8, or a 9. One of the major drivers of that, according to this productivity or production lens view, is time on the task. So humans tend to think that when things get hard, they're doing worse at them, which is often true. If
Mhm.
you're learning a language, you judge fluency by ease. If you and I are having a conversation in a foreign language that's not our first or mother tongue, if we're struggling with that, we'll know that. You can feel that you're struggling with it. Creativity is interesting and it's different because when things get hard, we often assume that we're doing worse, that, I've reached the limits of my creativity. So, for example, a company comes to you and says, come up with 10 names or 50 names for my company, and I want you to pick the best one. People generally think that the best ones will be the first five because they come really easily. But, almost all creative pursuits, the best ideas come only after the task gets hard, when you persevere through that. So a lot of people say, well, now it's getting hard, I'm going to stop and do something else. But actually, the production lens approach to breakthroughs in creativity says just add 50% longer than you think you need to the task. And it's in that extra 50% where the good ideas will flow. And there's incredibly robust evidence that even people who say at the beginning of the task, I'm not that creative, become much more creative once they persevere past the point where it becomes hard to have those good ideas.
And I've really seen that in action myself. So when we're running brainstorms or stretches, as we call them at EssenceMediacom, I really often find the best idea will be the one that comes in the last 5 minutes, just when people think they're out of ideas, and then suddenly there's this breakthrough where inspiration strikes, and you get to a really different, a differentiated place.
Hmm. Exactly. That's exactly what I see as well.
So leading on from that, I think there's sometimes I get the impression that advertisers can feel that doing something new is the riskier option than sticking with the status quo, and I think actually that's the wrong way round, and that real growth should come from delivering breakthroughs. How can we help our clients reframe that in their heads and think that actually the status quo is the riskier option than doing something different?
Yeah, well, there's a sort of optimal level of distinctiveness. Sometimes something radically or wildly new is perfect, and that's great if you can stumble on that idea. But optimal distinctiveness theory is this idea that there is a sort of tweak on an old idea, a reframing of an old idea, or a slight build on top of an old idea is usually the best way to go. And that's true in music, it's true in art, it's true in films, it's true in creativity, it's true in advertising based ideas. It's true in a lot of different domains, and there is science behind it. And what it basically suggests is that the best way to manufacture these new ideas is to take two existing things, or two or three or four more existing ideas, and bolt them onto each other in a way that's novel. So I have this document that's now about 15 years old, maybe even longer than that. And it's basically all the good ideas I've come across. I comb through ideas, and when I like them, I put them in this document. And so this is now a disparate collection of hundreds of different ideas that some sit well together in a natural way, some don't. But every now and again, I'll go to that document and I'll say, all right, let me see if I can take three that don't seem like they naturally fit together in any way, and see if there's if there's a Venn diagram that has these three circles. What's in the middle there where they overlap with each other? Is there something unique, unusual, interesting? Is there a business idea? I teach marketing, so I'm also very interested in advertising. Is there an advertising concept that maybe hasn't been explored before? And often I find that there is. So I think if you're talking to clients, the first thing to say is, something really genuinely old doesn't fly. Most advertising doesn't get much interest from people. We know this, that they bypass most messages. Something radically new, if you can find it and you think it works and all the testing suggests it's great, that's fine. But if you want to manufacture a sort of optimally distinctive idea, something that fits in the middle there, that's different, but that's not impossibly different, it's to take existing elements and then use them in new ways. And you can therefore, if you have those elements at hand, you can manufacture breakthroughs in a way that's much more predictable than just sort of hoping that something's going to land on you from above.
I really like that description. It's of bringing together sort of different old ideas that you've liked, and one that I'm definitely going to be applied. Now, you talked in there as well about music and art and so on. I'm a huge music fan, and I once heard a music critic describing Prince, who's my favourite musician, as always being not just one step forward, but one step to the left. And that's one of the ways I like to think about breakthroughs in my head, this idea of being new but also differentiated. Have you got any other mental shortcuts that might help people think about how they can achieve breakthroughs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic idea. This idea of being to the left rather than ahead. I think there's something problematic about always assuming that progress in creative domains is linear and forward-looking, that everything is forward and better than, and radically different from what came before it. Whereas what I think the sidestepping idea does is it suggests that it's just something that's a bit quirky and off kilter, that's maybe only a modest evolution rather than a revolution beyond what we have now is often the way to go. And I think Prince did that really well. And I think good music in general is just a little weird. It like takes what's now and says, I'm just going to put a spin on it. And I also am a huge music fan and a big Prince fan. And I think that's a good description of Prince's music. But the question about other shortcuts, I mean, there are other things you can do. And I think in the context of organizations, one thing to really pay attention to is, who is your brain trust? Who are the people that you're folding into your idea generation process? And I will sort of humbly suggest that there are three kinds of people that I would want on a team. And when I'm putting together research projects and consulting projects, these are the three kinds of people I like to have at hand. The first kind, I think, are most people that you work with, and they're specialists. They're people who know more about the area than anyone else. They're experts in advertising, for example, or people who know more about media than anyone else, or marketing experts. And they're very valuable because they know more about the ins and outs of the particular industry and the area than anyone else. And you need those people. They're very, very important. They're good for simpatico, for bouncing ideas off, for getting a kind of a sense of whether your ideas from someone who's most like you are good ideas. And that's very valuable. The other two kinds of people are very important too. One of them is they call these people non-redundant actors. A non-redundant actor is essentially someone who's not like objectively sort of butting heads with you, but there's someone who is just from a different sphere. And they're very, very valuable in the context of creativity. So an example of this is at NYU, when recruiters come to campus, as I teach at NYU, some of the good companies, the really smart, interesting companies, don't come and say, we're a marketing company, give us your 20 smartest marketing people. They'll say instead, we're a marketing company, give us your 5 smartest marketing students, but also we're going to go to the chemical engineering department, and then we're going to go to the French literature department, and then we're going to go to the organic chemistry department, and then we're going to go, and they bounce around and they find smart people who can learn on the job. They can become experts in the area, but their tradition, the flavor they bring to that position is different. They're non-redundant. And there's a huge amount of evidence that asking these people a question from inside your wheelhouse when they're outside of it is tremendously valuable. So that's the second kind of actor, the non-redundant actor. And then the third kind of person is the black sheep who is actively butting heads with you. It doesn't have to be in a rude way, but they disagree with you on some fundamental idea. And a really good example of this is Pixar. They have certain people who focus heavily on animation because their competitive advantage has always been that their animation is tremendous. They make hair look like hair, monsters' fur looks like fur, the water looks like water. They spend huge amounts of money on that. But if your story in a movie is not incredible, the narrative isn't there, it doesn't matter how good the hair and the fur and the water look, no one's going to watch for longer than 5 minutes. And so when they were creating the movie Up, for example, which has the most incredible opening sequence, about 5 minutes long, that's not about animation, that's about story making. And so you need someone to come into the group, and they do this. A number of the people who work there do this, where they'll bring someone in who says, I think animation is not the be all and end all, and we should spend way more money on narrative, on constructing storyboards. And then they have a little discussion about it, and bringing in this black sheep who disagrees with the fundamental central theme of what everyone else seems to believe is a very valuable thing too. So you want insiders, you want non-redundant actors, and you want black sheep. And with those three, it's a great rule of thumb for moving forward when you're in a group context.
That's really helpful, because I think, I think often people feel that maybe they have to act a certain way to deliver breakthroughs. And actually, the idea that you could have different roles, different types of people working in different ways, whether it is as the specialist or the black sheep, that everyone's got a different role to play in a team, because we are an organisation that works in big teams. So on to some more questions. So. How, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but there is a lot of talk about how the pace of change in the world is accelerating, and I think all of our clients, the advertisers we work with, are really feeling that and sort of seeing the pace of change in their markets. How can organisations and individuals anticipate and adapt to change more effectively?
Yeah, so I think one thing that happens with change is that until you react to it, are doing things the same way as you were doing them before the change happened. So that what happens with change, and this is often a reason why people and organizations get stuck, is they're doing things that work really well in one context, but then the context changes. So you saw this with the pandemic. The way we did things didn't work in that context for that 2 or 3 year period. And so we had to figure out ways of moving forward with different constraints and different factors at play. And in general, the world changes rapidly. The introduction of AI, generative AI, was a big one as well, that we're all kind of figuring out. Now the world has changed. What I was doing before, is it going to continue to work? As a teacher, I've had to redo all of my assessments. I can't give people an assignment that I used to give, because in 3 minutes they can get an A-level response from ChatGPT. So that's an example of needing to shift. So what do you do to fix that or deal with that? Well, one thing to do is, I work with a lot of organizations on a process known as a friction audit, which I talk about in the book. A friction audit is basically a periodic assessment of the friction points that we're facing as either individuals or as an organization. And what you do in a friction audit is you basically say, what are the things right now that feel the most difficult, crunchiest, hardest to move through, least fluid? And in an organization, you can often identify those things. And they're often things that respond to change or haven't responded to change. So in the generative AI space, maybe one area we feel friction is our clients are all coming to us and saying, help me with Gen AI. I need to know what to do. And as an organization, you bristle at that and say, well, we don't really have a mechanism to deal with this yet. So as you do this friction audit, you look for, first of all, where are the friction points? Where are we not able to deal with either our customers' needs or our own internal needs? Then you intervene on that friction point. That's the second step. So it's exploration, finding the friction point, intervening on it, figuring out something to do. It might be to assign a team as your Gen AI specialist team. It might be to take people who do other jobs and to say, hey, we're going to put you through a training seminar where you're going to spend a week learning about Gen AI and how to fold it into your work. Or maybe once a month, we'll have a Gen AI kind of all hands on deck meeting at the company, whatever it is you want to do. That could be your intervention. And then you confirm. The third stage is confirmation. Did this work? Did this fix the friction point? Did it either eradicate it, if we can remove it completely? Or in the case of, say, a gap in learning or understanding, have we smoothed down the friction point so it's no longer so filled with friction? Now, the thing about the friction audit is it's incredibly useful at responding to change if you institute it periodically. So management in a company, or even individuals, I do this in my own life, you could do it every 3, 6, 12, 24 months. It doesn't matter what the period is, but you go through this friction audit process over and over again, iteratively, so you can each time see what your last round of changes, has it been successful, and also what are the new changes that we need to think about. It's a really effective way of dealing with change, because it specifically responds to those change-induced friction points that come about as a result of the change in the effectiveness of things that you've been doing in the past that no longer respond so well to new conditions.
Feels like a really proactive way of doing that kind of self-reflection, self-examination. And I can imagine how, by repeating it over time, it also becomes easier to do as well once you're familiar with the techniques, something we can incorporate into our practice. So can you tell me now what are some strategies that that people can implement in their daily life to incorporate pauses to help lead to greater long-term success?
Yeah, this goes hand in hand with the idea of exploring. It's this idea that just kept popping up as I did more and more research, that we're always in a rush, which makes sense because the world is a busy place. We are responding a lot of the time to deadlines. No one feels they have enough time. That's just what it is to be a modern human being in 2024. Um, And so one of the paradoxical ideas here is that the most successful people have just a little bit of time slack where they pause. This is known as time slack, where you essentially say, I have a sort of down period and I have a minute to pause and to figure out my situation before I take action. And really, the whole book is oriented around this idea that the first thing that happens when you feel stuck is you rush to act. Humans are really good at dealing with physical stuckness. So if I entrap someone and say get out, they'll figure out a way to get out. We're very effective at that, and we're kind of evolutionarily we've evolved to become good at getting out of situations where we're stuck. But when you're emotionally or mentally stuck, the worst thing you can do is rush to act because it ends up leading you in a direction that is probably not the right one or the optimal one. So the idea with a pause is that you build in a pause before you act to pretty much anything. It's often referred to as the sacred pause. It's sacred because it's something that's kind of built into the way you live and respond to any situation that causes you alarm or discomfort or when you're unsure. One of my favorite examples of this is Lionel Messi, the soccer player or football player, since I'm talking to a British audience. I have to keep code switching. As an Australian, I'm half soccer, half football. But anyway, we'll talk football. But Messi, when he was a young player, he was very, very unsure of himself. He was incredibly nervous. He was very physically small. He's still of short stature, but he's a fairly robust guy now. But he was much smaller than a lot of the other players, and he was very anxious. And a lot of his coaches remarked on this early on, saying, you know, he's going to be a great player if he can get over this nervousness that he seemed to have in the early phases of a match. One of his brilliant coaches said to him at one point, what I'd like you to do is when you get on the field, I want you to, you're so good that we are willing to sacrifice you for the first 2 or 3 minutes of the game to allow you to have that time to calm yourself as long as you play at your best for the remaining 87 plus minutes of the game. So what Messi does now, you can watch this when you watch him, even now when he's playing for Argentina and Inter Miami, is when the whistle blows, everyone, if you mark their positions on the field, they're all running around, they're all moving around. Messi ambles around. He barely moves. If you look at him in the first few minutes of the game, he barely moves from the center of the field. And what he's doing is his eyes are constantly moving. He's darting around. He's taking in the scenery, figuring out where weaknesses might be. Are two players not working very well together? Are two players on his team connecting particularly well? Is there a defender on the other side that's not playing so well? He's basically getting this bird's eye view strategically of what's going on the field that he can exploit for the remaining part of the game while everyone else is running around like headless chickens. And it makes him incredibly effective. He's never scored a goal in the first minute of a game, but he's scored in every other minute of a game, at least once, because he's effectively not playing in the beginning of the game. But it makes him very effective later on. And I think there's something really profound to learn from that, which is that it is worth pausing now and having a long view, whether it's a 90-minute game or a career or a interaction with a client that's going to be several months long. It's worth slowing down early on because every decision you make thereafter benefits from that period of slowness where you really survey the territory. Maybe you have an algorithm you can use. Maybe you have a checklist you can go down. Messi has a mantra. He has certain things he says to himself to calm himself down. So he's getting a strategic advantage while he's also calming himself down. And there's something really valuable about that general approach to the world in accepting that you can't always go a million miles an hour. And in fact, if you start slowly, that makes you much more effective later on. So a pause is I think, very valuable.
That's great to hear. We've just conducted a 3-month-long breakthrough acceleration experiments of giving people techniques to help them deliver breakthroughs, and that was one of the themes there about the importance of making time. And I think it's a really good example there of how you can use that time to break through. So I think in the book you talk about cultivating curiosity, sort of childlike curiosity. Now, I think, often when people are working on the same clients all year round and perhaps, for 2 or 3 years, how can we encourage people and teams to maintain that childlike curiosity on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways to encourage curiosity. I think early on for adults, so kids are very naturally curious. That's one of the things I talk about in the book. They ask hundreds of questions a day. I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and there's no shortage of curiosity there. No one has to manufacture curiosity for them. They ask plenty of questions. But there's a point between being 8 years old and being an adult where we lose that instinctive curiosity. We sort of rest on our laurels, we figure out a way of doing things and we exploit that way, we stop asking whether it's the best way. And we stop asking what the alternatives might be. And exploration becomes something that just is a bit foreign to us, that we have to explore in a way that's much more deliberative. You have to decide it's time to explore. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just how people evolve as adults. We become much more exploiters than explorers, which is something you can intervene on. So one thing you can do if you're working on the same clients for a long time is to have certain questions you ask yourself. So one thing you can do is you could run a friction audit. You could say, has anything changed? Are there new friction points? That also forces curiosity because you're asking certain questions. You could ask questions like, is there anything else about the world that's similar enough to this or that overlaps enough with it that means that I could learn something from this other domain? Are there other companies in the same sphere? I can see what they're doing, and can I learn from that? Are there companies that are completely different, but they've done something really interesting and innovative? Should I be curious about the way they're approaching the business of promoting, marketing, media selection, and things like that? You could even just like have a general rule that every day I'm going to ask two questions. Two things are going to come up that are going to puzzle me, and my instinct will be to gloss over them, pass them by. But I'm going to make a point of either writing down the questions, even if I don't ask them. Sorry, if I don't answer them. But at least I'll have the record that I was curious about those things. And so over a week, I have 10 new questions that are things that I should explore alone or with other people. And there's huge value in that because it trains you to become someone who's much more curious, who doesn't let the things go by when you don't understand them. I see this when I'm teaching. I'll say a word that I know no one understands. Now, even sometimes I'll make up a word. And I will sort of watch the room, and everyone doesn't understand the word. I know this for a fact. It's a term of art, or it's not even a real word. But some people just say, all right, let's put that behind us and move on. There's always someone who sticks up his or her hand and says, can you explain that? It tells me a tremendous amount about the way that person instinctively thinks. When they don't understand something, they push back on it. And there is huge value to be derived from that. And I talk a lot about it in the book, that innate sense of curiosity that leads you to be an experimentalist, to say, are there other better ways to do things?
So you talk in the book, in the last chapter of the book, about the importance of action in really getting breakthroughs done. So could you tell us a bit more about why that's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. I do leave the book on that note, where I talk so much about strategy and dealing with the emotional consequences of being stuck, which I think are very important. But ultimately, no amount of navel gazing is going to get you unstuck to move you towards breakthroughs. So you have to ultimately act. Now, acting requires a lot of us as humans, especially if you're a creative who's trying to come up with creative ideas day after day after day, or in a business where you're doing different things every day. And so I talk in the book about Jeff Tweedy, the front man from the band Wilco, who also writes books. And he talks a lot about what it's like to have a creative career over a period of decades. He wakes up every day and he feels that it's his job, and it is his job to be creative, whether he's writing a new passage for a book, whether he's writing a new phrase in a song. It doesn't matter what he's doing. He's got to come up with something new and interesting. And so his action is kind of measured in the output of writing and musical production and composition. And he talks about this, what I think of as a really interesting idea. He says that a lot of days he wakes up and he doesn't want to be acting. He doesn't want to be creative. It's not what he feels like doing. He just kind of wants to lie around, or he wants to think, but he doesn't want to produce. He wants to take in rather than produce. And so he talks about this idea that on those days, he almost feels like there's a pond, and there's very clear, pristine water at the bottom of the pond, but it's covered with a kind of scum at the top. And what he does is he imagines that he's pouring the scum out so that what's left is those pristine ideas under the surface that are being covered by this, I guess, lack of motivation. And so what he does is for the first 15 minutes of those days, he lowers his threshold, which is normally very high because he's very good at what he does. He lowers it all the way to the ground, and he says to himself, I'm going to come up with the very worst phrase I can write, or I'm going to come up with the very worst chunk of music that I can compose. And I'm going to let myself do that for 15 minutes. I'm just going to let whatever comes to my head tumble out. And that has two effects. First thing is, if you liberate yourself to act poorly or badly, it's much easier to act. You take the threshold away, and it means that things tumble out. So you're much more productive in terms of quantity, which turns out to predict whether the quality will be better. The more you produce, the better the production tends to be. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is he often discovers that lack of inhibition liberates new ideas. it actually does make him more creative, and he produces better ideas and better content in general. So if you are struggling to act, give yourself 10, 15, 20 minutes to act in a way that would not normally satisfy your high standards, that would be below threshold. And then later on, what you'll find is that period of gearing yourself up, of getting the cogs moving, makes you much more effective in the remaining parts of the day. And I've always found that very useful. I do that when I write, and I do that when I try to come up with ideas. I'll liberate myself to have some bad ones first, and the good ones often flow thereafter.
I'm a big fan of that technique as well. We've just been running some creativity training recently, so anyone out there who's attended that will know that's one of the techniques that we teach. And yeah, I can confirm it really is a great way of letting go of kind of removing the inhibitions to creativity, allowing yourself to be deliberately bad, is often a great springboard for a breakthrough. So you have a really non-traditional and interesting epilogue for the book. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So this was something I debated with the publisher. What happens often when you get to the epilogue, the end of the book, is you're effectively done with the ideas, and then there's a sort of little flourish at the end to set you off on your way. And I've always found that in the context of breakthroughs, it's a little unsatisfying a lot of the time. Like, I've sort of done reading the book, the content is done. I don't want to spend time reading fluff at the end. So what I did for this book was, the epilogue is, it's titled 100 Ways to Get Unstuck, and it's basically a distillation of all the ideas from the front of the book. And so it's 100 ways drawn from the book itself to get unstuck, 100 specific techniques, that was a sort of attempt to make the book as actionable as possible. And I found that when people respond to the book, the most common thing I hear is, it's really nice to have this sort of digest of all the major ideas and themes from the book. It's good to read them in full earlier on, but then later on, as a sort of checklist, when I'm trying to get unstuck, it's useful to have those. So it is a non-traditional epilogue. It's not often that an epilogue is just a list of everything that came before, but I think it's useful if you're trying to use it as a kind of manual for getting unstuck and finding breakthroughs.
I love that, because everyone's going to have a copy of this book on their desk. And it means next time any of you are stuck at work, myself included, we'll be able to pick up the book, and there's 100 prompts there to help us break through. Well, look, thank you so much for making the time, Adam. Really appreciate that.
Thank you so much.